I'd like to welcome you to the first of our Meet the Candidates for Superintendent of Public Instruction forums. I'm Rhonda Dillingham, Executive Director of the North Carolina Association for Public Charter Schools. Tonight's forum is with Democratic candidate Dr. Jen Mangrum. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Mangrum.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you. And to the audience, I'd like to thank you also for joining us and taking the time out to learn about Ms. Mangrum and to hear her discuss her vision for public education in North Carolina and how charter schools might fit into that vision. Audience, I'd like to encourage you to use the chat feature throughout the forum, and if you have a question, insert it in the Q&A. If there's time at the end, we'll try to get to the questions, but if not, we'll be sure to get them to Ms. Mangrum to answer later. And if you experience any connectivity issues with Zoom, don't worry, just go to the association's Facebook page where we're live streaming the event. Now I'd like to recognize my friend, Ms. Linda Lynn Cakadelis. Today's event is co-hosted by the association as well as the North Carolina Coalition for Charter Schools. Welcome, Lindalyn.
Thank you, Rhonda. Yes, my name is Lindalyn Cakadelis, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Coalition for Charter Schools. We are a 501c6 organization with a single mission of advocacy. We daily work towards fair funding and maintaining charter autonomy. And it has been a delight to partner with Rhonda and the association hosting this candidate forum. We also partnered to conduct candidate questionnaires. 363 questionnaires were mailed to all the candidates who have the most influence on education. Candidates for governor, who appoint the State Board of Education members, candidates for lieutenant governor and treasurer, who automatically are voting members of the state board, and of course, our candidates for state superintendent. Then all the candidates for the North Carolina House and Senate. Please check out either of our websites to see the response of these candidates. I want to express my appreciation first to Dr. Mangrum for making herself available. I know these are very, very busy days for you. Charter schools are politically fragile and elections have consequences. And that is why Rhonda and I felt a forum specifically to address the issues facing charter schools was necessary. It's my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Donna Martinez, who will be our moderator tonight. Donna is currently Vice President of Marketing and Communications at the John Locke Foundation. She has been at the foundation for 17 years. Donna and her husband Rick host the Triangles afternoon news program, and this can be heard Monday through Friday, 3 to 6 p.m. on News Radio 680 WPTF. Donna, we're delighted to have you moderate our 2020 candidate forum tonight. Thank you for your time and interest.
Well, thank you, Rhonda and Lindalyn. It's great to be here. Really appreciate both of your organizations asking me to be part of this. I'm delighted to be here. The person who's elected the Superintendent of Public Instruction is going to be holding a consequential position in our state. My mission as moderator is really to give voters more information to make an informed decision. You need to know who both candidates are and what views and philosophies and priorities will really be driving their decisions if they're elected. Thank you to both of the candidates, Dr. Jen Mangrum, who is the Democratic Party's candidate, and Chancellor Catherine Truitt, who is the Republican Party's candidate as well. Now, due to scheduling, we're going to be holding two different forums. On Wednesday, September 23rd, we will be talking with the candidate for the Republican Party, Catherine Truitt. Tonight, we're very pleased to be talking with the Democratic Party's nominee, Dr. Jen Mangrum. Jen Mangrum is a native North Carolinian. She's a lifelong educator. Both of her parents were public elementary school teachers. Now, she holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she currently is a professor in teacher education. Dr. Mangrum, welcome. Before we start our conversation this evening, I'd like to ask you to take a minute or two to really share with us your vision of education in North Carolina should you be elected, particularly in light of the over 200 current charter schools, which serve over 120,000 students in this state. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. both the association, North Carolina Association of Charter Schools, and the North Carolina Coalition of Charter Schools. And Donna, you were the first person who introduced me, like completely correct. Everything.
Oh my gosh. Well, there we go. It's going to be a good night.
It's going to be a good night. I like to start by telling people who I am, because the reason I'm running is not about politics. It's not about power. It really comes from a place inside my heart. I was born and raised in Jacksonville, North Carolina, the daughter of a Marine, career Marine. My father fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam twice. But when he retired, he got his GED, his community college degree, and then he went to Wilmington, and he did become a fourth grade teacher. So Sergeant Robinson taught elementary school, and he chose Bell Fork Elementary School that's high in poverty, predominantly kids of color. I think I was about 8. And it was the first time I had a conversation about the inequity between schools. And, you know, when I went to Jacksonville before COVID and I said that, someone from the back of the school, back of the building said, it still is. And that's a problem, right? Because it's been almost 50 years since my father taught at Bell Fork. My mom was from England. I was mentioning that kind of off the cuff. An artist who taught kindergarten, and first in the churches, and then when it moved to public kindergarten, she went to Wilmington again. We lived very close to UNCW, and got her degree in elementary education, or her certification. And my mom, one of my favorite stories is Buddy Martin was a young man with cerebral palsy. Well, young man at the time, he was 5. His family wanted him in public kindergarten, and the school was pushing back because it would require resources, or he wasn't, he'd need things that they were afraid they couldn't handle. So my mom went to court for Buddy. Buddy got into her public kindergarten classroom, but he eventually became a pediatrician. So I watched these 2 parents not only say, but model for me that public education changes lives, particularly when it's high quality and everybody has, you know, opportunity. When I was 14, and I mentioned this earlier too, my mom had a massive heart attack literally right before school. It was chaos. My father left with her, the paramedics, and he left me alone. My older brother and sister were already gone off. And I didn't know what to do. And I walked to school that morning within 30 minutes of losing my mom. And I didn't even think about that until I started running for office, because to me, that's just what I did. And I realized that teachers are more than our academic scholars and leaders, right? They were compassionate. They took me in, they really supported me. And so I wanted to be an elementary teacher, just like them, and also like my mom. So ever since then, I taught elementary school for 12 years and then 2 years as a literacy coach. I earned my doctorate because I realized I like working with adults, which I didn't know that I'd do, and helping them be teachers. So my vision, and that's the question you asked, is about how do we make North Carolina a place where our schools are held up as models for the rest of the country. I've spent a lot of time studying what good instruction looks like. And I've been a champion for our children and our teachers. Children like Jen, who walk to school, right? These kids who come in with trauma and adverse experiences. Some of the things that I'd like to do, I'd love for us to think about starting with babies. I'd love for us to do something like Book Babies in Durham, where 6-month-old babies get books and they have a literacy person come into the home and help parents who are in poverty. You know, how do you connect with kids? How do you teach them language? How do you teach them phonics? How do you sing songs to them, right? Because those children right now, I want to expand pre-K as well, but those children, we already know that their outcomes are predicted by the zip code they're in. So I want to start early. I also want an Office of Equity at the State Department of Public Instruction, because we know from Leandro and from my dad that not all schools have the same access to resource and courses and classwork and teachers. And so I want to model at the highest level that that's important, and here's some ways we're going to do it. And then finally, because I'm a teacher educator in a school of education, and before I was at UNCG, I was at NC State, I know there's a disconnect between our schools of ed and what's happening in K-12 schools. And I really want to bring those together. Not only bring them together, but bring schools of ed together so that we're all talking the same language and to each other. I think that would be a really big step for North Carolina. I also want us to highlight the expertise in North Carolina. So, doing that, creating an Institute of Teaching and Learning that brings together faculty and teachers, I think would be a big step to highlighting, just what North Carolina has to offer. So my vision is really just pushing us forward and doing some of those kinds of things that are my dreams.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. How has the pandemic affected your vision and your mission as you look at education in North Carolina? And what do you think of Governor Cooper's executive decisions related to education? Particularly, I'm sure you know today, he made an announcement in which now they are going to lift the prohibition on K through 5, the elementary schools, give districts the option to go with option A, meaning bring all those kids back into the classroom. So talk to us a little bit about COVID-19 and specifically about the governor's actions.
So COVID-19 obviously has highlighted the inequities that we have with broadband, children with nutrition, kids having medical help and health care, issues that we already had, but they're magnified because now we have to deal with COVID. There's not an easy answer. I know that. The one thing I tell people is I don't think I know everything. I've never thought I know everything. And so what I want to do is learn as much as I can and do what's best for children. I feel like the state superintendent's job is to protect them and to make sure, in fact, the number one task of teachers is the welfare and the well-being of our children. I think academics is third or fourth. And so I care about these kids and I want them to have success academically, but I know they have to be safe first. So in light of what Governor Cooper said, you're the first person to ask me, so there you go. I thought my phone would light up earlier and it didn't. My concerns are, I'm a planner. I think a lot of moms are. And I want a plan that shows we're moving to B because we've met these metrics and we have these protocols in place. We can move to A because we've met these metrics. I'd like communication to be open. I'm very curious as to which schools are having outbreaks of COVID, right? And are they communicating that with families? I'm not against offering A as an option, but I think that what's missing was it was Governor Cooper and Dr. Cohen, but there wasn't an educator. And I'd like an educator who could really talk about, here's some things that we need to make sure that we can check off as we let students in. I think districts are doing a good job of that as best they can, but they need state leadership, right?
And
I think John put down the page.
Just to be clear for the folks who are watching us, Dr. Mangrum, so do you agree or disagree with how the governor has handled this education using his executive orders? And do you agree or disagree with the announcement today about allowing K through 5 to move to in-person instruction?
Do I agree or disagree with his executive orders? I'm not trying to be coy. I'm really thinking about this. When he moved from, I guess the first one was going from virtual to allowing hybrid, right? Wasn't that the first kind of executive order around schools? I think it was.
Offered the, he essentially set the ceiling, set the floor.
Yeah. So
at
that time I did not agree with Governor Cooper, and I went out vocal on my Facebook page because I felt like we didn't know yet what metrics were important in order to say it was okay to go from from C to B. And so I was vocal about that. I think that if it were up to me, I would have a huge timeline on my wall. And I would say, when we meet these metrics in this district, when we have these protocols in place, when we have this kind of funding, we're ready to move to B.
Does that mean that you think it's too soon for the governor to have announced moving to option A?
Well, first of all, I was talking about C to B at the time. Does that make sense? I don't want you to confuse that I was talking about C to B.
Right.
So now we're moving from B to A. I don't think it's the wrong decision, because there may be districts that are ready. There may have been districts that were ready weeks ago. But what I'm concerned about is I don't see a checklist. I don't see saying, if we have, do all our teachers have PPE? And I'd love for them to have N95s. Do all our children have access to get to school, right? Because if we open it up, we need to make sure that they can get there. Are our teachers safe? Are our children safe? Because ultimately that's the biggest question. I did listen to the conference today, the press conference, but that's all I've had time to do today. And so I wouldn't say I disagree with them, but I do wish that they had laid out a plan that was more meticulous and explained what it takes to move from C to B and then B to A.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about public charter schools. Do you believe that charter schools are siphoning funds from district schools? And if yes, why? And if no, why not?
So first of all, I think North Carolina is not doing their constitutional obligation to fund public schools. And that's all of us. Charter schools are public schools. The Leandro case, and Judge Manning came and did a Zoom with me. He's a great supporter. He's been fabulous. They have said we need a 40% increase in funding. I almost feel like the state is setting us up to fight over minimal funds. I have a friend who has 6 brothers and sisters, and he said, you didn't come last to the table because there wouldn't be anything for you to eat. You got there first. And I feel like they're having us fight over these minimal funds, where if Leandro was funded, then charter schools, along with traditional schools, would gain 40% more funding. And then we wouldn't be fighting over, is there enough? I feel like we're fighting over, is there a piece of the pie for me? When really we should be collectively saying, fund us properly so that we don't have to fight over funding.
So how much money is appropriate then when it comes to spending on education?
Well, they say 40%, and West Ed was the largest public education study, or close to it, in the nation. And they came back saying we don't have the things we need to offer equity between our schools. For instance, we don't have school nurses in every building, except some once every 5 days. So when you say how much, what I would say is I didn't study it, but West Ed did. And they feel that all schools together should get, I think it's about $7 billion over 8 years. 3.5 or so, I may be off a little bit, to catch us up in the short term. And then 3.5 for all of us to think about how do we continue so that we have teachers at the national average, so that we have good principals in every building, so that we have funds to provide materials for our students.
Okay, so charter schools receive about 73% of what districts receive. So how would they be draining funds?
I don't understand what you're saying.
Okay, do you believe that charter schools are draining funds from district schools?
I believe that we're all fighting for proper funding, yes. And
okay.
So you asked me, oh God, did I lose you?
Nope.
Wait a minute. Oh, there you are. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah.
I believe they are. I believe that funds are being taken from public schools, traditional public schools, to help pay for charter schools. Yes. But I wish that if we had enough money, this wouldn't be a fight. This wouldn't be an argument, right? The problem is I'm hearing from superintendents that they're struggling to pay for their school buildings, for their electricity, for the bills that don't change, right? They're continuous. But they shouldn't have to even worry about that, right? They ought to have what they need. And I think that's the question we should be asking our General Assembly. And if we get 40%, that goes for charters as well as public schools, traditional public schools.
So, according to the 2019 annual charter school report, self-reported data from the state's charter schools indicate that 65,000 students are on wait lists for admission. So, do you think that there should be a cap on the growth of charter schools, and why or why not?
Well, the thing about charter schools is they were a bipartisan initiative, right? So they shouldn't be partisan. We all thought that charter schools should be part of what we offer our children. When you ask me in the way you're framing it, say it again. Say it again.
Well, there's 65,000 roughly on a wait list for charter schools.
Right.
So, do you believe that there should be a cap on enrollment growth of charter schools?
I don't think there should be a cap on enrollment growth, but I'd like to see a cap on the number of charter schools. And I kind of wonder why charter schools would even want more charter schools, because the idea is, right, it's a free market system. It's you offer something that public schools don't. So I'm not really sure why even charter schools would want more charter schools. Could you help me understand that?
Well, I'm just here to ask the questions. The issue is if parents are wanting more choices, and public charter schools being one of those choices, and we know that because there's a wait list, we have more demand than we have supply. So are you thinking then that I'm not quite clear on whether you think that there should be more or not? Pardon me?
There's no cap. I don't understand. There's no cap. So why is there a waiting list?
Well, because there's a certain number of seats.
But we could have more charter schools. It's not against the law. We could continue to grow our charter schools.
Right. So you would be for approval of more charter schools and allowing more seats.
You're mixing things up. You said to me that there's a waiting list. Mm-hmm. So why shouldn't we have more? And I asked you why charter schools would want to compete with one another. But if you're asking me if there's a waiting list, why don't we have more? There's not a law stopping that. So I don't know why we don't have more. If you're asking me, would I put a cap on it? I do think that we need to put a cap as to 100 is what the original agreement was, until we get funding under control. If we weren't all fighting for the same dollars, because charter schools are doing a dual system in lots of different districts. So yeah, I would want a cap, but that's not something that's under my purview. And if we don't have a cap and there's a waiting list, then that doesn't make sense to me. Like, why aren't we opening more charter schools?
So there's about 120,000 students who are being educated in charter schools. And what do you say to those parents who obviously like the school that they're in because they are keeping their child there? What do you say to them about protecting their right to have that choice and that option for their child?
And I have been asked, right? Because I know people who are in charter schools. I care about their children, and they'll be under my purview in that my job is to provide resources and to remove barriers that cause them to not be successful. So I want those children in charter schools to do well. I want the educators to have what they need to be good teachers. And so I want those things for them. I'm not anti-charter schools as much as I'm, how do we do this in a way that everybody has what they need?
Well, how would you then do it in a way that everyone has what they need? Help us understand more.
I am going to fight for Leandro so that we have 40% more increase in funding. And even if we don't get to that, we get to a place where everyone has what they need to provide their students with the access to materials, to good teachers, to buildings that aren't crumbling. That's my job. And it's just as important for the charter school families as it is for traditional public school families. Just because I think that we need to look at the policies that govern charter schools doesn't mean I don't want the best for the children that are in them. Doesn't mean that I want to close them and shut them down. Doesn't mean that I don't think good things are happening. For example, this was probably a year ago, but a woman named Louise Scoggins told me about a school in Wilmington that's a charter school that's a girls' leadership focus. And she said, are you against that? I said, no. I mean, the idea is charter schools should show us some innovation and help us as traditional schools know what works. I'm not anti-charter school. I'm just, can we do this in a way that we're not pitted against one another? Another example would be, and this one ended up not being a charter school, but in Greensboro, they wanted a KIPP school. And so Mr. Ellison, who wanted to propose a KIPP school, went to the superintendent, Mo Green, and said, I want to do this. And Mo Green said, that sounds awesome. Why don't we do it under the purview of the school system? He said, well, if we did that, would we be able to do A, B, and C, things we want to do? And he said, yes. And they worked together to create a KIPP-like, it's not a KIPP school, but a KIPP-like academy in High Point. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that we don't have to be against one another. We need to think about how do we work so that all the children and the educators get what they need to be successful in school.
You've mentioned Leandro and the proposals there in the West Ed report. Would you then support a funding mechanism such as a tax increase if that were required, and to actually fully fund the West Ed recommendations and Leandro?
So a superintendent can never recommend a tax increase. That's going to come from the General Assembly.
Right, but would you support it?
What I would support is currently I know that $3 billion over the past 3 years have gone to corporations for tax cuts. And so I would want to work with those corporations and say, look, do you want this tax cut, or do you want really good schools so that you bring your employees to this community? And so that's what I would be thinking about, this conversation of how do we get what we need in a way that doesn't hurt families and doesn't hurt people's ability to feed their family and to have a happy life. So
help me understand more about how you would go to corporations and talk with them. How would address the funding?
Yeah, that's not my job. Although I will talk to corporations. I have a program called uncgtlc.org. It's a STEM teacher leader collaborative. I literally knocked on doors of local corporations in Greensboro to say, can you help me fund this? So I won't say I'm completely against talking to corporations. I hope to work with Best NC. I hope to work with the businesses that want to contribute to education. But I probably, as in terms of the tax cut, leave that to the governor and the General Assembly. But that's something I have heard Governor Cooper talk about, is that if we didn't give away tax cuts to large corporations, we would have up to $3 billion now.
Okay, so just to be clear for the people watching, so if there were a proposal to raise taxes in order to provide more funding to public education, would you support that tax hike?
Like how much?
Any amount.
I feel like, Donna, you're trying to get me, actually I feel like you're trying to get me in some ways to talk about things that I have no control over, that I have no influence over. I can tell you right now, the General Assembly is not going to raise taxes or lower taxes because of the state superintendent. But I will tell you that if you ask me, if the General Assembly and the governor came together and said, we're going to do Plan A, whether that's raise taxes or not, but we're going to do Plan A because it will fund traditional schools and charter schools so that they have the things they need, I would say, hot dog, let's do it.
You've talked about equity, and that, of course, is an issue that's important to everyone, regardless of politics or ideology. Everybody wants every kid to have an opportunity to be the best that they can possibly be and go out and be productive and happy people. Charter schools, they traditionally have a lot of support in polling from ethnic and racial minority families who are just looking for something different. What do you say to those people who are looking for an option, who feel like that they're looking for equity and they're looking for opportunity, and they like that option? What do you make of that?
Take it. I mean, I do think that every child needs to find what fits them. One of my biggest regrets is that I didn't put my oldest daughter in early college. I think that would have been a really good match for her. And so I appreciate that parents are trying to find the best fit for their child.
So
And
do you support school choice?
well, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so would you support then changing the funding system so that the money follows the student versus going to the system?
And that one I don't know a lot about. I'll just be honest. I don't know. I'd have to look into that. Like I said, I don't know everything. I realize that. I'm really open, and I'm hoping tonight, I'm taking my notes, that I'm learning from you as well. And that's one I'd have to look more into.
Well, that certainly would be one way to allow parents to make whatever choice works best for them and then have that money follow them rather than going into a system. So that would be interesting. How do charter schools, which constitute less than 8% of the total public school population, specifically contribute to school district segregation? I know that you've talked before about concerns over segregation and resegregation. Help us understand your thinking on that.
Well, it's not my thinking. It's the research produced by Ladd and Singleton from Duke in 2017. And I had that article, as well as I've talked to Helen Ladd many a times. Maybe cause is not the best word, but it has continued to influence it and broaden segregation. Because charter schools, particularly ones that are built in particular communities and they don't offer transportation. I mean, there are schools, charter schools, that are predominantly Black, and there are charter schools that are predominantly white. And so where we place them is really important. But you know what, Donna? It's the same with traditional public schools too. Like, this isn't just a charter school problem. I think that when we have schools that represent North Carolina with diverse people, that our students are better critical thinkers, problem solvers, they're more empathetic, they become aware of their own biases, and hopefully in the workforce, you know, they become better people because they've had the chance to experience school with lots of different people. But I do feel like a lot of charter schools and some of the initiatives, for instance, the one that wanted to put a charter school in Huntersville, and I don't think they went for it around Charlotte. I think it was dropped. But when we put them in white affluent communities and we don't offer transportation or lunch, we're really limiting who can choose that school, if that makes sense. I would like to see our schools be more inclusive, for sure.
How would you go about that?
So one thing is the Office of Equity. I think that we need to have hard conversations about systemic issues around race. This is one, right? This is a conversation where I'm getting to speak with Rhonda and Linda Lynn and you. It's not easy because there's not a magic answer. The only way we're ever going to really think about how do we have inclusive schools that bring people together and bring people in from a variety of cultural backgrounds, economic backgrounds, race backgrounds, is to have these really hard conversations about what's keeping them out.
Speaking of race, interesting study and you probably are aware of it, Dr. Seth Gershenson of American University, concluding that in our state, charter schools have about 35% more Black teachers than district schools, and that Black students in charter schools are about 50% more likely to have a Black teacher than their district public school counterparts. What is your theory about that?
I did not know that, and I say kudos. Great. I need to look more into that because we definitely have to recruit more teachers of color, because when a child sees someone who represents them, someone who is like them in lots of different ways, their achievement goes up. So that's excellent. That's a great number to have.
I noticed that on.
Can you tell me who that was again? I know you said
Sure.
American University.
It's Dr. Seth Gershenson of American University.
Gershenson.
Okay. It's a really interesting study. It really is. I was looking at your website and I noticed that you had a banner on your website that says Save Public Education. Save it from what and from whom?
So public education's under assault. I believe that by not funding our schools properly, it encourages people to give up on public schools. And public schools, I told you, my mom and dad taught me that that is where opportunity lies. So the biggest went to whom is the General Assembly. And it's because if we don't fund them, then if we don't fund our teachers, they find other places to go, like South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee. If we don't give our schools the resources they need, teachers can't teach in ways that are innovative and creative and exciting. If we don't fund our schools properly, they crumble. They don't have good ventilation. They don't have access to technology. When I say save public education, North Carolina needs to think about how do we be the best? Because right now, I feel like our schools are starting to, and it's not even our schools, it's communities, it's people. The narrative is, I teach elementary education. In 2008 at UNCG, my initial class for Introduction to Education was 200 plus students. This semester it's 61. We're in a crisis. A Pew poll, a national poll, says parents don't want their children to be teachers, more than 50% of them. We have to save education so that people realize the Mrs. Travis that I talked about earlier, the teachers that changed my life. I grew up after that in poverty, after my mom passed away, because my father, it was too much for him. It was too much. But teachers saved me. I want to save schools so that they're the places people want to be. And they have got to have the materials. They have got to have great teachers. They have to have people who want to be principals. And right now, it's going in the opposite direction.
So we've talked a little bit about funding. We've talked a little bit about equity. And accountability and transparency, certainly another key factor about education. So in terms of charter schools, we've got a charter school performance framework report that noted that almost 96% of charter schools met or exceeded all the financial and operational goals. So in your view, do you think that the state's charter schools have appropriate oversight and accountability?
I think they do. I think the one place that I would like to have more transparency is in the business relationship with CMOs. But in terms of accountability, they're taking the same test. They're having the same, funding structure. But I really would like to understand the relationship between the schools and the CMOs.
Help us understand that more. CMO, meaning?
For CMOs, the management companies, the charter school management operations, because I don't want people using our students to make money. I want to know that the money that's made is going back into the school to make it better. That's what public school is, right? And so I'd like to know that. But honestly, Donna, I want to know that about traditional schools too. I want to know where they're spending their money, and are they doing it in ways, because that is part of my job, are they doing it in ways that are helping students or are hurting students? So it doesn't matter if you're charter or traditional, that's something I'm interested in.
So is your concern the for-profit aspect of that, public money and a for-profit relationship?
Yeah, because typically if you're making a profit, some students not getting what they need. Now, I may go in and do audits and find out that's not so. But what I want to know is it hurting our students? That's what I need to know. Right now, I don't have access to those documents. I don't have access to them in traditional public schools either. But, everybody wants to know that our public dollars are being used to help our children and that they're getting the best education that we can give them. And so I think that's part of my role in all schools across the state. To think about, are you spending the money in ways that are helpful, or are we wasting money?
So do you think that then vendors of schools make a profit?
And what do you mean by vendor?
Well, if someone has a contract with a school and it's a for-profit company to provide XYZ service.
What I'm saying is I don't know. I want transparency in that. When you asked about accountability and transparency, that's what I want to be able to see.
Okay. And so, for example, right now, North Carolina appropriates public money to private and for-profit preschools So do you have a concern about that?
I don't think they fall under DPI. I think they've been moved to DHHS.
But in concept, do you have a
Well,
problem
if
with
they report
that?
to me, yes. If they report to me, I want to know that I'm looking out for our kids. And I want to know that the money's being spent properly. I don't think it matters if you're a Republican or a Democrat, if you're for charters or against charters, if you're private or not private. You want to know that the money going to our schools is being spent in a way that helps our children excel and not wasted in ways that don't help them.
So if you, after investigating, determined that you didn't like the relationship with a for-profit organization, would you put an end to that?
So that is so hypothetical. I can't answer that because you haven't given me specifics. What are they doing with the money? Are they misusing it? Do kids in that school not have the materials? Do they not have access to good curriculum? It's not just what are you doing with the money? It's also and I think some of that goes on now too, right? The state does check into charter schools as well as they check into traditional schools. I know that some charter schools have been closed because they haven't been appropriate with funding. That's part of the job. And so can I close them or not? That's hypothetical. I don't even know if I have the power. My guess is it goes to the General Assembly. But I certainly would provide the information that I find to the General Assembly and the state board and say, here's what we're seeing. Now, we need to talk about these kids and how we're going to make sure they get what they need and deserve.
Yeah, and speaking of accountability, of course, as you know, public charter schools, if over time, if they fail to perform and meet expectations and standards, well, first of all, parents can walk with their feet, but also they can be closed down. Do you support that? And if you do you support that same requirement for a district public school?
The thing about shutting down is I don't think we should ever shut down in the middle of the year. And I'm not even talking about what are the terms that made that school shut down, because our children, that disrupts their education. That disrupts their community. Even when schools, my daughter experienced traditional schools that redistricted and then moved kids, from one school to another. And I think that hurt her growth and her social skills. So just shutting down a school to me is a very dangerous thing if we haven't really thought about it. Just like I told you I wanted to plan about moving C to B, B to A, I would sit down and say, we need a plan. The other piece is I'm not authoritarian. Even though I had a Marine father, that's not how I roll. I think that charter schools and traditional public schools need to both learn me and I need to learn them. And we need to have conversations like the one we're having today. So let's say we're going to shut down, or not we're, I guess I don't know who actually shuts them down. I'm assuming it's the state board. But the state board recommends that a school shuts down. To me, we need to have lots of conversation about why that is, what's happening, what have we done to save the school, how do we help the kids that are there, and how do we help them, if you're going to shut it down, how do we help them transition to something else? Because ultimately, it's not about shutting down the school or not, it's about those children, that's their community, those are their teachers. And so I think conversations have to be had. I don't think it's as black and white as you might think it is. Nothing's black and white with me. Everything's a conversation. Everything is what's it going to do to teachers and parents and children? And how do we mitigate so that it's the least disruptive? Because we all take with us the experiences we had in school. I bet you remember your elementary school and the teachers you had. These are not just small things. They embed themselves. They press themselves on our lives. So I would never just say, oh, that school's doing this, shut it down. No, that just wouldn't happen.
Does that mean you don't support the rule that says that a public charter school can be shut down if it fails to perform?
No, because I said we'd have to mitigate it so that it's the least disruptive. So let's say, because you're being hypothetical, let's say there's a charter school and the principal's embezzling money. and the students don't have the materials they need, and the teachers are complaining they're not being paid. I'm making up like the worst case scenario, right? And the state board says we need to shut this school down. What I would say is, can we get around this table and talk about how to do this, if it has to be done, in a way where we don't disrupt the lives of our children? And so it may mean putting it off till summer. It may mean, how can we bring in supports? Because my job is to provide supports and remove barriers. How do we do that so that we don't impact the children in negative ways? So again, it's not black or white. I support shutting down. It's case by case. And then when it's case by case, it's how do we do this in a way that doesn't negatively impact my third grader or my high school senior or whoever it happens to be.
Well, Dr. Mangrum, I wish we had more time, but it has gone by very quickly.
Oh gosh, it has.
I know, I can't believe it. It's been an interesting conversation. I would like to give you an opportunity just to make a quick closing comment,
Sure.
Particularly to all of the charter parents who are watching this. What is your message to them?
So I'm looking at the chat. It was really hard to, as one panelist, to answer all the questions and look at the chat. But Rhonda asked lots of really good questions. And Rhonda, I'm happy to come back and answer those. Maybe we'll do it through email. But some of the things she asked are really important to me. The last one was, well, actually someone has written one since then, but would you come to your school? Yes, that's my favorite thing, is let me see schools in action, right? Let's talk about schools in action and how I can support or remove barriers, because that's the job of the superintendent. It's not to make laws. It's not to make policies. It's to provide those supports and barriers so schools can be successful. She also asked, I'm trying to find it. There was one earlier I wanted to answer. I'm struggling to find them. Oh, you asked about my definition of equity. For me, the definition of equity is when my circumstances, whether it's my race, my culture, the proficiencies I bring to school, my parents' education, but when those things are predicting my outcome in academics, then we have a concern, because those things shouldn't matter. So to me, equity is when those things are not a problem, right? When those things are gone. And some of the things that Donna talked about were right around those issues and things that charter schools are looking at, right? Charter school families need to know, I don't think because you're a charter school family, there's something negative about you. What I think is we need to have conversations about how do we make all public schools spaces where children thrive, where they have the most inclusive opportunities they can. And by the way, I don't know the percentage, but a large percentage of charter schools have moved to a weighted lottery system, so that they can have more inclusive, classrooms. And I applaud that, because to me, it's not win or lose. It's not open or shut down. It's how do we do this in a way that we are giving our students the best possible education they can have. And to me, that means also all children being inclusive. And they haven't been in some spaces, and we need to talk about that. And I know it upsets people because they love the schools they're in. And I'm not trying to take your schools away. I'm trying to say, how can we do this better? How can we do this in a way that supports everybody? And it might mean having some really long conversations, hopefully when I win in 2021, about how that happens. One of the first people I talked to in Charlotte, a teacher at a charter school, said, Jen, people ignore us, don't include us, don't think we exist. And I was like, we're going to have conversations. That's what we're going to do. Yes, I don't like when schools dismiss a student for some reason, because if it's school choice, then parents ought to be able to choose that school. And so how do we do that in a way? And her school happened to be very inclusive and very diverse, but how do we do it in a way so that everyone thrives? That's what I want to do. I don't want to hurt a child or any family. because I do think parents should have input in the types of schools their children go to.
Well, Dr. Mangrum, I appreciate you talking with me tonight. This has been a really interesting and conversation, and I hope it's been helpful and informative to other people as it has been for me. Dr. Mangrum, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Rhonda and Linda Lynn.
Yeah, and Rhonda, I'm going to learn about Seth Gershwin, and I'm going to learn about both those organizations, the Association of Charter Schools. I've written this stuff down in the Coalition of Charter Schools. I'm not a bad guy. I really am not. I'm a teacher. I'm a former third grade teacher. I just want to do what's best for all our kids. And I appreciate you guys having me tonight. It meant a lot to me that you reached out. It meant a lot that you had me. And I realized that, not everyone's going to agree with me. We're not all going to agree with each other. Like I told you, I didn't always agree with Governor Cooper. But that doesn't mean we can't work together to have really great schools. So thank you.
Well, we thank you. And I feel like it's always important to try to find common ground. And something you said at the very beginning is something that I'm sure every single person on this call who cares about children agrees with, and that is we want to do what's best for children. And I can tell you that I've worked in the districts, I've worked in charter schools, and our charter school folks are some of the hardest working people I know, and they love and care about these children just as much as I'm sure you do. And there's so much more we could talk about. I would love to talk more about that Ladd Singleton study, and I'll put that loosely. There's more to talk about there, and I will certainly get you the one that we referenced, the Seth Gershwin study as well. Many of the school leaders I see in the chat have invited you to visit their schools. I know it's difficult to do that now because of the health restrictions, but at some point we hope that you can do that. And then I would also like to say,
I promise you,
thank you. And I'd like to say that if you are elected as superintendent, I would strongly encourage you to bring charter folk to the table. There's a lot of expertise and knowledge and innovation that needs to be shared. Right. And we're willing to do it. And I would love to see there be bridges built between the district schools and the charter schools because it's, again, what's best for children. Anyway, I'm going off on my soapbox. Can you tell?
You're good. You're good.
I'd like to thank Dr. Mangrum for joining us, and I'd also like to thank you all, our audience, for participating tonight and listening in. This is a very important race, and I encourage everyone to get involved. And be sure that you're registered to vote, first of all. And everyone, school leaders on the call, please be sure that you have communicated with your folks that it's important to be registered to vote and to participate in the process. I'd like to remind everyone about the forum we'll have next Wednesday with Catherine Truitt on the 23rd at 7 o'clock also. And at this time, I'll turn it back over to my friend Linda Lynn.
Rhonda, thank you so much. And Dr. Mangrum, it was great. Thank you for your time and for being part of this. We're like what Rhonda said, and I don't think I can add much to it. Rhonda, you said it all. We want to be at the table. And so many times charter schools are not at the table when having these kind of conversations. So we're gonna hold you to that.
Yeah, you will. I have no doubt, Linda Lynn.
All right.
No doubt. Call me up and go, you said.
We'll have coffee first, though. How about that?
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for tonight. Donna, thank you so much for your part in this, and we appreciate you. And again,
she's a pro for sure.
She is. I've worked with her for years, and we just are. I'm so thankful she was part of it tonight, and we'll be part of it next week. Don't forget, everybody, go to our websites and see our candidate questionnaires. That's there. And then also, if you're interested in schools, if you're interested in getting parents more involved, please send me their names. There's lots to be done before November 3rd. And like what Rhonda was saying, this is a very, very important election. All right, Rhonda.
I put my how to email me in the chat before you go.
Sure.
It's jenmangrumfornc@gmail.com. There we go. Just if somebody wants to send their question or wants to reach out to me, I'd love to hear from them because I really didn't get to address all the questions in the chat.
Right. We appreciate it. We know it's hard when there's just one candidate.
No, I wanted to breathe.
But yet it's good. It's kind of free flowing, and it's like we're at your kitchen table. So this was
We're in your kitchen, aren't we? I could tell.
No, we're in a sunroom, but that's okay.
Oh.
All right. Thank you. Thank everybody for participating.
Good night. Thank you all.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Y'all have a good night.
You too.
Bye-bye.